In the opening pages of his new book, Bishop Robert Barron tells us, quote, Christianity is, by an order of magnitude, the most persecuted religion in the world today. Between 360 and 380 million Christians face high degrees of hostility. Conservative estimates are that more than 5,000 Christians are killed annually, and the 20th century produced more Christian martyrs than all of the previous centuries combined, close quote. Bishop Robert Barron, on his important work, What Do Their Deaths Demand? Christian Persecution Today, Now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. Bishop Robert Barron is the bishop of the Diocese of Winona-Rochester and the founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He is the host of Catholicism, a groundbreaking, award-winning documentary about the Catholic faith, which aired on PBS. Bishop Barron's most recent film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players, was nominated for an Emmy Award and has been syndicated for national television. Bishop Barron is also a #1 Amazon best-selling author and has published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology and the spiritual life. His recent book, This Is My Body, sold over 1 million copies. He was a religion correspondent for NBC and has also appeared on Fox News, CNN, and EWTN. The number of people that have seen Bishop Barron on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook is just immense. Bishop, welcome.
Todd, thank you. Always good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Segment 1, the most persecuted religion. In What Do Their Deaths Demand? Bishop Robert Barron writes, quote, St. John Henry Newman distinguished between what he called notional assent and real assent. The former is the intellectual consent we give to propositions, and the latter is the visceral affirmation that we give to matters concretely observed and deeply felt, close quote. And in his haunting novel, The Plague, Albert Camus wrote, quote, Since a dead man has no substance unless one has actually seen him dead, 100 million corpses broadcast through history are no more than a puff of smoke in the imagination. The 1,000 dead made about 5 times the audience in a biggish cinema. Yes, that was how it should be done. You should collect the people at the exits of 5 picture houses. You should lead them to a city square and make them die in heaps if you wanted to get a clear notion of what it means, close quote. And finally, the Soviet tyrant Joseph Stalin once darkly and perhaps apocryphally quipped, "One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." So, Bishop, let's just start with the obvious question. Why are we so numb to the countless Christian deaths around the world?
Well, I mean, you've named a lot of it there. And of course, I hardly ever agree with Joseph Stalin, but there he agrees really implicitly with Newman, that notional assent has to do with propositions, and that's important, but it doesn't really grab you at the deep visceral level. But real assent is the assent that we give to something that's deeply felt. Well, when you say, for example, it's true, Christianity is the most persecuted religion in the world. Well, that's a proposition. That's more of an abstraction. And we say, that's terrible, or how interesting. But then when you tell the story of someone who has been put to death for his faith,
right,
that grabs you at a much deeper level. A second reason I think why we overlook it is wokeism. I'm a great critic of wokeism. And one of the marks of wokeism is a tendency to divide the world into the binary of oppressor and oppressed, right? Now, who belongs on the oppressed side? Well, women and gays and people of color and non-Christians, like just the other,
Yeah.
Who belongs on the oppressor side? White men, Christians. We're on the wrong side of that divide. And so we tend not to notice that, in fact, Christians are being massively persecuted. But it doesn't fit the neat little narrative of Christians are always the oppressors. No, in point of fact. And that other stat that you mentioned, which I think is still staggering, the 20th century produced more Christian martyrs than all the previous centuries combined. So you think, the age of martyrs was long ago, the first few centuries. No. The great age of martyrs, we're in it. It was the 20th century, and it's continued into the 21st century.
So much for progress, right, Bishop?
Yeah,
I mean, we're just getting better and better, people say, and sure enough, more and more people are dying in droves. In What Do Their Deaths Demand? You immediately explore specific martyrs. So before we discuss this in any particular way, why was it so important to tell about these specific stories?
For this very reason, because they grab the imagination. The way they grab mine, like as I heard these stories, it brought it to my attention in this very vivid way. When, abstractly, I would have known from my reading, yes, Christianity is this very persecuted religion. But when these particular stories came to my imagination, they changed me. I think I cited, maybe in this book or maybe elsewhere, the line attributed to Lincoln, which might be apocryphal, but when Harriet Beecher Stowe came to the White House, and the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that Lincoln purportedly said to her, well, that you're the little lady who wrote wrote the book that started this great war.
Mm-hmm.
The point being, everyone knew about slavery. We've been talking about it forever, but this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, brought it so viscerally to mind that it kind of animated the North. That's what these stories do. They move us to action. Newman said that too. That propositional assent, or notional assent, rarely moves you to action.
Mm.
Real assent does. That's Churchill. We're going to fight in the beaches. We're going to fight in the streets. We're going to fight on the shoreline. We will never give up. I will give you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. All of that is boom, boom. It's Anglo-Saxon, and it's direct, and it's imaginative language. So the stories of the martyrs, and that's why I tell them, even though they're kind of gruesome stories, I think they bring it to people's minds in a way that propositions don't.
So let's talk about a few of the martyrs that are featured in this book. What do their deaths demand? Many listening still remember the shocking starkness of 21 Coptic martyrs of Libya. They're marching in their orange jumpsuits along the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and then they're kneeling with black-clad, knife-wielding ISIS executioners standing behind them. Just to say a few words about this horror show.
Yeah, it's the one that I think it brought the thing to my radar screen for the first time, really, was that story. It was 2015, so I was named a bishop in 2015, so I was either in California or I was still in Chicago. And I heard that story. These young men, they were all young men, and they were, I think, laborers. They were in Egypt, the Coptics, and they were kidnapped by, Islamic extremists. And the extraordinary thing is they're brought out, and this thing is filmed, We've seen, happily just bits and pieces of that. The whole thing was filmed. And they did not fight against their persecutors. And most of them were murmuring prayer and expressions of their faith. And there was a kind of calmness about them, even as they faced what they knew was certain death. And then their killers were unambiguous, that it was a message to the people of the cross. It was meant to be a very stark threat to the Christian world. They even spoke of Rome, So it was unambiguous. Was this like a tribal dispute or an ethnic dispute? Well, maybe at some level, but they made it as clear as they could.
Right.
This was a religiously based killing. This was persecution of Christians.
Right. Moving on to Father Jacques Hamel. He's an 85-year-old parish priest. Many of us remember this because it's shocking that this poor, old, small, diminutive man, 85-year-old parish priest, celebrating Mass in the Church of Saint Etienne du Rouvray when two 19-year-old men stormed into the parish. What happened next?
Well, they slit his throat. I mean, they held him and some others at church for a while, and they were threatening them. And Hamel, by all accounts, was invoking God's power against Satan. He was saying, "Va-t'en, Satan, be gone, Satan." So it wasn't just these two kids, but there was a power behind them that he was recognizing, right? But at the end, they slit his throat. Now, I remember this one because this is the following year, 2016. I was in Krakow for World Youth Day, and I was speaking this night to this grand gathering in this huge arena, 25,000 kids. And I had a talk all prepared, right? But that day, the news broke about Jacques Hamel. And so I remember I told this stadium full of people, I said, I prepared a talk, but I'm not going to give it. I want to talk to you about this priest. And I don't know what I developed, something about the cross from there or something, but it so grabbed my imagination that I decided to make it the centerpiece of my talk to these 25,000 kids. That's how deeply it affected me.
Yeah. Journalist, Marquette grad, and Catholic James Foley found himself called to report in ISIS-dominated, war-torn Syria and Iraq.
Yeah.
Tell us what his story was.
That one I remember, as you mentioned, he's a Marquette grad, as my brother and sister were both Marquette grads. I know Marquette very well. Kind of, brought the story home. He's a journalist who had gone to Libya around the time of, the Arab Spring. and he wanted to cover that situation. And he was kidnapped there, and he was held. And he said during his time of incarceration, he prayed the rosary, but he had to pray it like on his fingers.
Sure.
But he remembered the rosary that I think his grandmother had taught him. Well, he was released. And you think now, if that
I'm going home.
right, I would have said, okay, I'm done. I'm
Mhm.
going home. Well, he went back, and he went right into the belly of the beast at the time when ISIS was most on the march in Syria and so on. And he went back there to cover it. And again, he was captured, kidnapped. And this time there was no happy ending. They beheaded him. And again, it was filmed, which is, it makes it so nauseating, you know. But I think it was the fact that he was so close to home, you know, an American had gone to Marquette University, like my brother and sister. Those three did really leap out at me as particularly vivid examples.
If you could, speaking of going into Africa, the richness of Nigerian Catholicism, but then the radicality of its enemies, Boko Haram, the schoolgirls that were taken. Say a few words about them.
Well, a couple things. One is, you know, when ISIS was kind of contained in the Middle East, but it didn't go away, ISIS sort of moved to Africa. And so that very militant form of Islam ended up there. And of course, Nigeria is a famously divided country. The north is largely Islamic, the south Christian. But they were going after a vibrantly Catholic country. When I was at the Synod in Rome, those 2 Octobers, and on the mind of a lot of people was the church in Germany, you know, with the synodal way, and what about the Germans? What are the Germans saying? And I said on several occasions, why are we worrying about what the German church is doing? Why don't we study the Nigerian church? I said, something like 95% of Catholics go to Mass on Sunday. The seminaries are bursting. You know, despite enormous persecution, the church is thriving there. Why don't we study Nigeria? I used to say. So I think what you found there was this clash of a very strong Catholic culture and then this deeply anti-Christian movement.
Lastly, there's so many martyrs we could talk about, but let's talk about the 20th century communism, specifically in China, and its adversary, the Catholic Church. Jimmy Lai and Cardinal Zen, a couple of big names. Your thoughts on them?
Yeah, you know, Jimmy Lai, of course, is this great businessman from Hong Kong, became a great defender of, you know, Western values, political, economic, and otherwise, and was, you know, active in some of the protests against the communist really incursion into Hong Kong. And he's arrested, and he's been held now for the past many years in solitary confinement. And it came to my attention through, you know, writers and so on. And then I was able to establish a personal contact with him. And, you know, he does these pencil drawings, and I think they're pastel paintings he does in his cell. And he was gracious enough to send me one of those.
Wow.
And so and he said he uses some of the Word on Fire material and all that. So I just felt this personal connection to him, and the heartbreak of it. We've been trying, I know the government's been trying for years to get him out. Protests have been made. I signed a protest along with a number of bishops. It was during the first round of the synod.
Sure.
We signed that. And I think, you know, when President Trump went to see President Xi in China, I think he asked about Jimmy Lai. But so far, he's not been released. But it's, you know, to me, a sign of the oppressiveness of that government.
Cardinal Zen, would you say a word or two about him?
Yeah, I'm a great hero. Cardinal Zen is, I think, now in his late 90s, and a former Archbishop of Hong Kong, and a great opponent of Chinese communism, and a great spokesman for Catholicism. In some ways, he's like a John Paul II. You know, John Paul II standing against communist tyranny in Poland. Zen is very much like that in China, and of course has paid a very high price for it. He's under very careful surveillance by the Chinese government. He's been persecuted. He's been imprisoned over the years, and he stands strong even at the age of 90-something. So I have great admiration for him.
Segment 2, why the persecution of Christians? In What Do Their Deaths Demand? Bishop Robert Barron writes, quote, "It is of supreme importance to notice the difference between the manner in which the great religious founders died. Buddha passed away full of years, surrounded by his disciples, sure of the success of his great spiritual reform. Confucius peacefully died of old age in his bed. His followers resolved to carry on his ethical teachings. Moses expired, the Bible tells us, at the ripe old age of 120, not permitted indeed to enter the promised land, but sure that he had successfully led his people to freedom and provided them with divine law. Muhammad died in bed in his home after a brief illness, knowing that the entire Arabian Peninsula had been converted to the religion that he founded. And then there's Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Bishop, how was Jesus' fate different, and why did that matter?
You know, as you read that, you know where I got that idea from? A theologian I don't often agree with, but I read him when I was a young man. In Hans Kung's book called On Being a Christian, he makes that observation. And it's always stayed in my mind that the other great founders, almost without exception, you know, die peacefully and full of years and guaranteed success and all that. But and we don't hide this. In fact, look, I'm wearing this right here, that Jesus dies, this young man, on this terrible instrument of torture, his friends and followers having abandoned him, people mocking him as he dies. That it's the exact opposite of someone dying peacefully in bed.
Yeah.
It's someone who's, by all appearances, his movement has been a failure. And he dies even with, God, my God, why have you forsaken me, on his lips. That's an interesting contrast and worth thinking about. And also the fact that we Christians don't hide it. We don't pretend it was otherwise. No, we hold it up. I know one thing, Christ and him crucified, Paul says, right? We wear the cross now as a sign. So what does it mean? Well, one thing it means, I think, is the radicality of Jesus. All the other people we mentioned, you know, religious founders or philosophers or people that were given a revelation or they came to an insight and they shared it, and good, you know. And I'm a philosopher by training. I love philosophers and all that. But again, then there's Jesus. He's done to death. Why? Because people disagree with his ideas? No. They disagreed with this still staggering claim that he made, right? So in John's gospel, it's explicit. You know, I and the Father are one. He who sees me sees the Father. But go back into the synoptics, the same thing, you know. My son, your sins are forgiven you. And they say, well, only God can forgive sins. Well, right, you know, by implication. You've heard it said in the Torah, the highest possible authority, but I say, well, who would have authority over the Torah for a first century Jew? God alone, you know? Unless you love me more than your mother and father, more than your very life, you're not worthy of me. But you couldn't imagine Muhammad or Confucius or Moses or the Buddha saying that. No way. Yet Jesus says that. That's why he was hounded to death, right? Now, the next question, well then, why are we paying attention to him? Because he rose from the dead, thereby confirming the truth of what he said. He is who he says he is. Therefore, there's a choice involved, you know, as he himself put it, right? Either you're with me or you're against me. Either you gather with me or you scatter. Jesus compels a choice the way no other founder does. And now see, my point here, it's not to excuse, of course, Christian persecution, but it is to understand it in a way. You see why from the beginning Christians were persecuted, because Christ was persecuted. Christ was done to death. And the world hated me, the world will hate you, Jesus said. So again, it's not to excuse Christian persecution, but it's to understand it. Given the very claim of Jesus and of the church, the opposition emerges.
You're listing off the various things, and I wrote that down here: a stumbling block to the wise, the corner rejected by the builders, cornerstone rejected by the builders, something greater than the temple is here. Before Abraham was, I am. The Father and I are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father, on and on and on. I think you've said this before. Anybody who wants to domesticate Jesus into a wise teacher, but with no claim on him being divine, is not reading the Bible, is not familiar with the Gospels, because he's saying it again and again and again.
Well, you know, it's Lewis. C.S. Lewis was the great teacher of that truth. I mean, to generations of people now. That you can't get away with saying, well, you know, he's not God, but he's a great person. He's a great. No, he's not. If he's not who he says he is, he's a lunatic of the first order. He's a lunatic beyond. I remember Bono of U2 said he's a lunatic beyond Charles Manson. If this man is saying, I am the center of your life. I'm the highest possible good. I'm more important than your mother and father. I and the Father are one. I mean, if he's not, then he's a lunatic.
Yeah.
And so we can't, as many do today, live in that sort of safe middle space. Oh no, I don't think he's divine, but he's a great teacher. No, he's not. If you're not with him, you should be against him.
So to this point, the Romans took Jesus' claim to kingship seriously. They crucified him. The Pharisees and the scribes took Jesus' claim to divinity seriously. They clamored for his crucifixion.
Right.
Why don't we? Is it just that we're blind and deaf to the story? We've domesticated the man God because it's sort of inoffensive, or we're just unschooled. What is it about us today that makes us so casually capable of domesticating into something other than what he was?
Well, because the burden of affirming his divinity is so great.
Yeah.
I think if you affirm the divinity, then my life has to belong to him.
Yeah.
Then he must be the Lord of my life. And not just a nice person that I follow or someone whose ideas I admire, but no, the Lord. And I'll go back to Paul, right? Jesus Kyrios. Jesus is Lord. Caesar was Lord. He was the one in charge of your life. Now it's not Caesar, it's Jesus is Lord. A non-divinized Jesus is a lot easier to deal with. A domesticated Christ is a lot easier. Again, Lewis, said, even at our best, most of us Christians will invite him into the front parlor of the house 1 hour a week, right? But I don't want you hanging around my house.
Yeah.
I don't want you in the kitchen or in the bedroom or in the rec room, or I don't want you there. But Jesus the Lord is not just to be entertained for an hour in the parlor. He wants to be Lord of the whole house. Yeah. That's why I think we find his divinity so hard to take.
So with respect to the dark powers of the world, what did Jesus' resurrection achieve? Because it was very telling, and you've done this so much, and it's part of our narrative as Catholics. The story doesn't end with the crucifixion. The resurrection is the pinnacle, if you will. With respect to the dark powers of the world, what did the resurrection achieve, and how then would we expect the dark powers of the world, especially considering this book, to respond?
Yes. In Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, which is a movie I admire in many ways, there's that scene, where there's Jesus and there's the crowd kind of around him, and they're taunting him and so on. And then behind the crowd, he has that image, that kind of creepy, I think it's
androgynous.
Right, I think it's an actress, but it's meant to look very androgynous. She's carrying this even creepier baby, and she's walking behind, and no one in the crowd notices her, but she's walking behind the crowd. That to me is a good way of suggesting the biblical idea, right? That there are dark powers that we can see, the corrupt, political and economic and interpersonal powers. But then behind them is this sort of regnant, invisible, fallen spiritual power. And that's, you can't read the New Testament without noticing that. Think of Jesus at the beginning of his public life doing battle with Satan. See, before he begins his public work, he has to deal with that power. He has to engage that power. And then what you see throughout his public life is just that, is the powers that you can see opposing him. Think of scribes, Pharisees, and so on and so forth. But then behind them, the invisible power. Now, all that comes to a climax on the cross, where indeed there are visible powers that hound him to the cross. But implicitly behind them are the dark powers, So the cross itself is this great cosmic struggle.
Yeah.
Think there too in the book of Revelation, I always say it's the fourth Christmas story, where the virgin's laboring to give birth, and there's a dragon poised there to devour the child. That's a very dark telling of Christmas, but it's true.
Yeah.
That there was a spiritual power, a fallen spiritual power, that opposed Jesus from the beginning, from the moment of his birth, opposed him all throughout his life, opposed him to the point of death, which is why the resurrection is the victory, not just over fallen human powers, but over the fallen spiritual powers. Now, does the battle go on? Yeah, read the book of Revelation now. It's a bit like D-Day versus VE Day. So at D-Day, the battle was won.
Yeah.
right? So June 6, 1944, less than a year later, the war is over. But there was still a lot of mop-up work, right?
Yeah.
There was still the Battle of the Bulge. There was still a lot of... We're in that period. We're like between D-Day and VE Day. That's called the era of the church, right? So the struggle with the dark powers goes on, but they've been defeated.
Yeah.
They've been defeated.
So this, I want to quote from this book, What Do Their Deaths Demand? You write, quote, there exists, and this is what you just said, there exists a fallen spiritual force that lies behind the dysfunctional structures of society and the twisted wills of individual sinners. Jesus will indeed address both personal and institutional sin, but he knows that a successful engagement with those more obvious evils is predicated upon the defeat of the awful, invisible authority that conditions them, close quote. Now, Bishop, frankly, I'm just being very blunt. How does a society that is scientistic, materialistic, distracted, incurious, cynical, skeptical, how did they come to believe what you just wrote?
Here's my first observation. I think anyone that's lived a little while knows I can't explain the depth of evil that I see simply by appealing to fallen human beings. I think there's a level of evil that is so deep, it's so profound, that we say, nah, there's something else going on. You know, another small book I wrote, Letter to a Suffering Church, I begin with that observation, that it was the sex abuse scandal that reaffirmed my belief in the personality of the devil. Because, and I still affirm this, the sex abuse scandal was such a masterpiece of evil. Right? When you think of how that scandal continues, but undermined the work of the church in every way. It compromised the church in every way. It was devilishly clever in its design, you might say. It convinced me there's more here than bad human actors. Plenty of those around. I'm not excusing anybody. Plenty of them around. And we deal with them as best we can. But I don't think that's enough. Now, that's the first observation. Here's the second one. If you're a scientist, there's no serious scientist that can do his work without mathematics, right? It's a basic thing of physics and chemistry, biology, that there's always the discovery of the mathematical intelligibility of reality. To say mathematical intelligibility is to say the invisible, because math deals not with the particular things, it deals with intelligible patterns. We call them numbers or equations or relationships or whatever. David Tracy said that the best access to the invisible today would be the sciences, precisely in their mathematical dimension. So the thing is, I'm a materialist, right? No, you're not. We deal with the invisible all the time. We deal with this, which Aristotle saw, and Plato saw too, how the invisible and the visible are interrelated, right? So there's a principle. Now keep pressing it. God's made this wildly variegated world of physical things, right? Think of the variety of physical reality. We know about numbers and equations and relationships. We know about the invisible. Isn't it likely, given God's sort of fecundity and his effervescent creativity, that the invisible world would also be richly variegated, right? So think now of Teilhard de Chardin. What are the odds that between us and God, there just yawns this ontological abyss? Isn't it more likely, and here he agrees with Thomas Aquinas, that area is filled, in fact, with, think of like an ocean full of organisms. Think of our bodies with the trillions of cells and so on. That space between us and the visible world and God is, in fact, filled with a huge variety of the invisible. Now, take it for another step. If some of those invisible realities are creatures, we call them angels, right? Pure intelligences. Isn't it likely some are righteous? They've stayed in union with God. Others have fallen. And that's, of course, the claim of the great tradition, that there are fallen, invisible, personal powers. Now, we'll call them the devil. The trouble is, right away you think, red suit and pointy, horns and all that. No, but we're signaling a very serious level of reality. An invisible but personal and fallen realm that has malicious intent vis-a-vis our world.
Mm.
Look, I'm 60-something. I won't tell exactly. I find that completely credible.
Yeah.
I do. If you'd asked me when I was a young kid, studying philosophy, so I'm very skeptical. It's all symbolic language. No.
Yeah.
The more I'm at it, the longer I'm at it, the more I find that completely credible. That there's this world that we can't manipulate and control, that yet has an impact on our world. And some of that world, right, lower than God, higher than us, some of that world is benevolent toward us. And some of that world is not, right? And so those are the powers that we're dealing with. And, we invoke them in the liturgy all the time.
Yeah.
We're always talking about the angels, and we're asking deliverance from, temptation and from evil. So no. The older I get, the more credible I find that.
Segment 3. What do their deaths demand? In What Do Their Deaths Demand, Bishop Barron writes, quote, "When one reads history with the eyes of faith, he will easily see that the red dragon seen in Revelation has expressed himself through thousands of King Herods up and down the last 20 centuries, all of whom have had the same purpose, the snuffing out of the Christ life in the world. The struggles against powers seen and unseen has been a mark of the Christian church from the beginning of its history." So Bishop, in the 21st century, what role does the Catholic Church play in fighting the evils of Satan and his acolytes? And why does it seem that in our current state, we're still the underdogs?
Well, look, I'm an Augustinian. In a way, we're always the underdogs. So Augustine construed the church as like a little Noah's Ark, and it's bobbing along this great ocean of a dysfunctional world. I think that's totally credible.
Yeah.
So the church is you can point to certain eras and certain figures where the church seems triumphant. But no, I think until the eschaton, the church is more like Noah's Ark. It's a place of safety. It's a haven, where a microcosm of God's good order is preserved. But it's bouncing upon the very rough seas of a fallen world. So no, we're underdogs, and we have been, from the beginning. That's why, even today, we know materialism and secularism are indeed threatening us. But we've been threatened from the beginning.
Yeah.
The waves of culture have crashed against us. The amazing thing is that we're still here.
Yeah.
The amazing thing is that Noah's Ark is still bobbing along, because look, at any point in the history of the church, smart people could say, it's done, And go back to the ancient world, people like Celsus, he's talking to Origen, and, these early dismissive figures of Christianity, what a hopelessly childish thing. And then look at key moments in our history when it looks like we were going under. We're still here.
Yeah.
That's a strange mystery. And our job is to be a haven, yes, and also a source of resistance. Here I think of John Paul II, young Karl Wojtyła, right? Nazis have come in to conquer his country and his beloved Krakow. And he goes to the underground seminary of Cardinal Sapieha, he and his friends, some of whom were killed because they were caught by the Nazis going to or from the seminary. John Paul survives. And then the communists come.
Yeah.
And then he continues in a little more public way, but still to kind of hunker down. Think of those kayaking trips with the young people, and he was forming them in John of the Cross and Thomas Aquinas and the great Polish literary tradition. That for a long time, he was on Noah's Ark. He was preserving something, right? And then, to me, though, that splendid moment when, as Pope, against all expectations, as Pope, he speaks the great truth of Christianity in the public square, dominated by a communist dictatorship. But he unleashed the power of the gospel, right? In a way that, this is in our lifetime, the whole world changed because of that.
Right.
That's how the church operates, I think, it preserves something, and then at key moments, it resists evil and it announces this great truth to the world. And then the powers of darkness have a way of regathering, and they'll try again. Like, in the scene of the gospel when Jesus confronts Satan and begone Satan, and Satan leaves, but to return another time. Yes. That's emblematic, I think, of the whole life of the church, right? That we're battling these powers. We've won the victory in Christ, and so with confidence, Think about like Maximilian Kolbe going to his death at Auschwitz. I mean, talk about someone in the absolute belly of the beast. But what was he doing? Is he was still resisting and he was witnessing to Christ. And where are the Nazis? Well, they're long gone, thank God. Kolbe's influence is just beginning to gather steam. That's the way it works, I think.
The director of your doctoral dissertation, Jesuit scholar Michel Corbin, once told you, quote, "The only legitimate imperialism is that of the martyrs," close quote. Tell us, what does that mean?
I remember that. Michel Corbin, he's still alive. He's a great guy. He's a Jesuit priest at the Centre Sèvres in Paris. And he gave seminars when I was a young doctoral student. And, I took a number of seminars, and I was just really impressed by him. And so I chose him as my thesis director, and he walked me through that whole time, and great man. But one of the debates at the time, this would have been like 1989, 1990, is the church too imperialistic? Is the church, imposing itself and the grandiosity and all that stuff? And somehow that came up in the seminar, and he used that line that the seul impérialisme, the only imperialism, is the imperialism of the martyrs. And I love it because it catches that paradox. It really is an imperialism. And the martyrs are witnessing to Christ the King. Yes, he's the King. He's the Kyrios, as Paul said. He's the Lord, and he wants to be Lord of the whole world. And so go and preach to all nations. There is an imperialism about Christianity. We're not meant to hide ourselves away, right? As Karl Barth said, we're not meant to hide behind Chinese walls. Dead right, No, we go out. I always quote there Barth's counterpart, Paul Tillich, in his German. He said, "Mit klingendem Spiel." We go out with fife and drum, And that's right. That's the way the church goes out. But so it's an imperialism, but it's not the imperialism of the world.
Yes.
That's backed up by weapons and by threats and by violence. It's backed up by the gospel, by love and by forgiveness and by nonviolence. So he catches that paradox beautifully, the imperialism of the martyrs. And see, that's why all these victims of this anti-Christian persecution, they're, the martyrs today who are witnessing. That's what martyr means. They're witnessing to this truth.
Do you, on that note, do you think that those who are persecuting Christians recognize that they're almost playing, I don't want to say they're playing into the Christians' hands, but Christians recognize martyrdom. Christians recognize our Lord as the crucified Christ. Do they realize that in killing Christians for their faith, in a sense, it's going to lionize those victims in the eyes of the faith? I'm just curious about, not that evil is evil and it can be irrational. It just wants to inflict harm and doesn't consider the consequences. Maybe that's the answer, but what's your sense about that?
They never seem to get it, do they? The Tertullian principle, right? That the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. He saw that a long time ago, but they were convinced back then, oh yeah, we'll get rid of these people. Or I think of the Ugandan king that killed Charles Lwanga and his friends. I often say, anyone watching that scene, here's these kids, these young teenagers and 20-year-olds who are being led out to Namugongo, this place near the capital, and they were speared to death or burned to death, right? Anyone watching that would say, well, Christianity's done. Well, where's that king and his successors? No one knows. But to that site, every year on June the 3rd, come 1 million African Christians. They never seem to get it. They never seem to get the principle that, the more you kill us, the more they don't get it. They don't get it. And that's, again, the devil, of course, is extremely intelligent. He's a pure intelligence, as Aquinas would say. Fallen, but a pure intelligence. But in a way, talk to the exorcists about that too. In a way, there's a opaqueness or something about the devil. He doesn't get it. Does the same thing over and over again without seeing this actually isn't working.
I asked Father Steve this question once. I said, wasn't the devil aware that in inflicting the passion and the crucifixion of Christ, he would ultimately be resulting in his own defeat? And Father Steve said something to the effect that the devil hates so much that but he hates so much that it obscures
that he's blinded.
Obscures logic.
No, I think that's right. That the hatred blinds him. So he's massively intelligent, and we all know what that's like. You can be massively intelligent, but be so blinded by your hatred. I think that's probably a correct way to put it.
Yeah. So there's a wonderful story you tell, but I think it's actually visualized in the Catholicism series, where Cardinal Francis George is musing from the Vatican balcony just after the election of Pope Benedict XVI, and he's surveying the scene of all of the piazza of St. Peter's Square and so on. And he was asked, "What in that pensive moment? What were you thinking?" Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, I love that story. He's standing next to Cardinal Pell, who was a good friend of his. And the camera sort of catches them. And he had this extremely pensive expression on his face. And so, and I think the photo appeared in the Chicago papers. And so a lot of people began to say, what were you thinking of? So when he was asked, he said, well, I was gazing out over toward the Palatine Hill. And from the balcony of St. Peter's, you could kind of see over in that direction where, the Roman Forum, and that's where the Imperial Palace was. That's where the emperor lived, the Palatine Hill. The Circus Maximus was there on the other side, and the emperor could go and watch the, games. And so the glory of Rome, the grandeur of the Roman emperor. And he was looking over there thinking, where are you? Where's your successor? Nowhere. Yeah. Your whole empire's turned to dust. There's no successor to you, Julius Caesar or Augustus Caesar or, Marcus Aurelius. You're all gone. But the successor of Peter is right there. And he's waving at the crowds and live and well. And it is a remarkable thing. Yeah. Just even if you are a total secularist, you don't believe in religion at all, just that fact is interesting to think about.
It really is.
How in the world has this institution survived?
Yeah.
When it's a great Roman Empire. What Bob Dylan in his song, it's about the Jews, but all the empires that enslaved them are gone, Egypt and Rome, even the great Babylon. And it's that idea of they've all come and gone.
Yeah.
They've all come and gone, but we are still weirdly here with all of our flaws. I'm a bishop of the church. I know the flaws of church people and my own better than anybody, but we're weirdly here.
Yeah.
And they've tried. God knows they've tried
to
knock us out, That's mysterious. I don't care if you're the most secularist historian. That's a mysterious thing to think about.
Yeah. There's a great Hilaire Belloc quote. You might recall this, where he says, "The proof of the divinity of the church is in the fact that with the way it's run and all its knavish imbecility, it wouldn't have survived without the Holy Spirit for a fortnight."
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That's right. So there's some power.
No offense to the power,
No, I totally get it. There's some power, though, that's sustaining us despite the persecution.
Yes. I wanted to reach in as we come to the closing minutes. We thus far have answered a lot of the how and the why of modern Christian persecution.
Yeah.
The obvious next question is, what are we to do about it? And you summarize some nice ideas. I just want to throw there's 6 of them quickly to you. Pray for the persecuted.
Yeah. Nothing great ever happens in the Bible apart from prayer. It's not decorative, it's not secondary, it is essential. And so I think anyone that becomes aware of this anti-Christian persecution, pray on a daily basis for those who are under persecution.
Yeah. Stay informed.
Yeah, and that's why I wrote the book. I do think a lot of Christians don't know about it. Many people have said to me now, in the light of this book, I had no idea. I never heard those stories. And so find out, and there are a lot of ways to find out. The internet makes things so easy now. Go on anti-Christian persecution. You'll find out a ream of information. So find out what's going on.
Persuade the government to take action.
Yeah, in the measure that it can. Not that governments can solve this thing perfectly. They can't. I'm not calling for let's just go on a crusade or a war. But I think there are some things that government can do. And, encourage your legislators, encourage the president, write to your representatives and encourage them to take action.
Well, this is a lot of your good work on the Religious Liberty Commission. So,
and that's one way. As we are attentive, this would be an extreme example of the violation of religious liberty. But indeed it is. That's what persecution is a violation of that principle. So, we're trying to find ways to use the legislative power of our country to fight against this.
Provide aid to the persecuted?
And you can do it through all kinds of channels. Go online, look up all sorts of organizations that are rebuilding churches and are providing protection and providing food and shelter and so on. And you can. So make a donation is a good idea.
We covered this a little bit. Respect religious liberty at home. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, to me that's interesting. Because see, if our religious liberty, which is a great American principle, First Amendment, if it's respected, it becomes a beacon to the rest of the world.
Mm.
If they can say, and look, America, the leading superpower, the dominant nation of the world, they respect religious liberty. They're going to battle against anti-religious persecution.
Right.
Trust me, when people around the world, they look to that, it's like a beacon of hope, So when we allow it to slip and we become less attentive to religious liberty here, that's a bad thing for the rest of the world.
Right. And finally, resist soft religious persecution.
Yeah, and that'd be another show we could talk about, because these extreme examples of people being killed and churches being burned down and all that. But there are softer forms of it, and you see it in forms of wokeism today, when religion is seen as on the bad side of the binary, and it's superstitious and it's oppressive and it's disrespectful, and so let's in different ways mock it, limit it, don't provide conscious protections for it, don't allow Christians to dissent from certain practices, and that's alive and well in our country. That's one thing that we were really fighting on the Religious Liberty Commission.
2 last questions.
Yeah.
What can you say, given what you've advised there, which is great advice, what can you say to people who fear their prayers, their petitions, and even the policies for the persecuted Christians go unanswered or insufficiently answered? What can you say to those people?
Keep going. Don't give up hope if what you want doesn't happen immediately. Things happen in God's time and God's way, but you do what you can. Again, think of Maximilian Kolbe. The end of his life, he's at Auschwitz concentration camp. It's 1942. The Nazis are on the march all over the world. He must have thought, "What? I've utterly failed. What a waste of time." On the contrary, he becomes now this great beacon to the whole world. Don't give up. Do whatever you can.
Finally, Bishop, how would you say the martyrs have informed your own ministry?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's probably relatively late in my writing career and all that I really came upon these stories and they had a bigger impact on me. For much of my time as a writer and teacher, it wasn't all that central to me. But as they became clearer in my consciousness, they had a big impact on me. I think all these things we talked about, of the reality of evil at all levels, physical and spiritual, but also that imperialism of the martyrs, this power of the church that's true up and down the ages. I do tell this story in there, I think at the very beginning of the book, about this night at Mundelein Seminary. I'm about 24 years old and, second year theologian. And we had this big banquet, I remember that night, and we're all there, and it was, everyone's in a good mood. And the guest that night was Bishop Alfred Abramovich, who was actually a great man. He confirmed me when I was in 6th grade. I still remember it very vividly. And Alfie, we called him. But Bishop Abramovich was a friend of Karol Wojtyła. He was a Polish Chicagoan, but spoke Polish and was in Poland a lot. And he was smuggling things into the country during the communist period. So knew Wojtyła very well, kind of a heroic figure. Well, that night he was there, and we're all having a banquet, a good time, and he got up and he gave this very moving speech. It was right after the death of Jerzy Popiełuszko. You know that story?
Yeah.
The young Polish priest, the beginning of the Solidarity time. The communists are still very much in charge, but inspired by John Paul II. So the Warsaw We Want God speech was 1979. So this is only a few years after that. Like maybe it was in 1984. And so Abramovich told the story of this heroic young priest who spoke the truth and challenged the communists, and then was killed for his troubles. I mean, he was brutally put to death. But it sparked this enormous, spiritual reaction and revival in Poland. Well, he told the story in very moving ways, and the whole room just went silent, But what struck me that night was I was 24. Popiełuszko died, maybe he was like 35 or 6. I mean, not much older than I. And it made everything so much more real, like what the priesthood can mean.
Yeah.
And, and having banquets and being nice to people and all that is great. But there's the priesthood in its configuration to Christ. So I remember that story had a big impact on me when I was a young guy.
Bishop Robert Barron, shepherd, disciple, and champion of persecuted Christians. Thanks so much for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
God bless you, Todd. Thanks.
Thank you.